Well, hello, ladies, gentlemen, everything in between or on the outsides, in the diverse, often ignored, esoteric angles of the gender matrix. What am I saying? I don't know. But I'm super psyched for today's episode. Something I've been working on for a while, and I can barely wrap my mind around it. Sorry. I'm just excited. I promised a listener I would try to refrain from random loud outbursts, but, you know, sometimes you gotta squee. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. And I'm your host, Michael Lucht, warrior poet, intergalactivist, international man of misery. Today's episode, part of a series that I've been working on. It's a little something different than how I normally approach subjects. Let's just say I'm kind of like a detective, and I'm starting with a hypothesis, so like a scientist detective, and going to take all the information and just try my damnedest to just shove all the information and shape it and direct it into my hypothesis like a dirty, crooked scientist cop of some kind. I don't know. I don't know how to put it. But you'll see going forward. The best term I've been able to come up with, and I think the most catching and alluring, that will hopefully draw in people's attention, the hook, line, and stinker, Black Magic Academies. Now, it's not just Black Magic Academies, it's Black Magic Academies and their potential interrelated connections to various global, quote-unquote, hotspots of various high strangeness, anomalous phenomena. The potential relationships between these two concepts. And this is actually even part of a larger, overarching, conceptual framework, I guess, connecting some of this episode of this series, as well as various other interconnected episodes that sort of tangentially fit into this overarching conceptual exploration, if you will. Really been looking at the idea, concept of place. Space and time, singular points. How a place can, over time, can or does exert a sort of sentience or will of its own. Now, I kind of broached this a little bit in the last episode, kind of setting it up a little bit, but the template I'm using here is Skinwalker Ranch. Now, I assume most of my listeners pretty well versed in weird shit in general already. Like, if you listen to this show, you know, you're probably, I would say, I don't want to like toot my own horn indirectly, but conspiracy theory / high strangeness / weird shit in general, you're in the AP class, I'd like to think. So, I think you got a pretty good familiarity with Skinwalker Ranch, like, even despite the TV show or whatever. And, I mean, that rabbit hole goes deeper than one might initially think. There's a lot of odd intersect and overlap and interest in that particular place, from the government, obviously, the Defense Department, you know, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Haven't read it, but quite familiar with the background of everything that's going on. Even more strangely is the intense interest displayed in that particular area and the phenomena, plural, taking place there. The interest that's been exhibited by Mormons in particular. It's very strange. Something I will look into in depth at a later moment. But that could just be, you know, simple geographical overlap, you know, correlation is not necessarily causation, etc. But, it's in their backyard, so to speak. So, could be just as simple as that. But, anyways, I digress. I'm super psyched about going forward with this. And just, I'm trying not to spill all the beans of everything going forward, but, this has been one of the more super fun topics, and overarching conceptual, just, I don't know, memeplexes. Just, conceptual overarching idea of place. And, to a degree, I guess you could call it psychogeography, megalopolomancy. We have centuries upon centuries of the ideas of sacred geometry and sacred architecture. So my interest lies in what is the opposite or inverse of that. Everyone talks about, well, there are more studies and mentions of things like sacred sites, holy places. So what is the inverse of this? Well, that would be infernal geometry. You have the sacred, the profane. So profane architecture, dark megalopolomancy, dark psychogeography, etc. So chicken or the egg. You have ideas like residual hauntings and stone tape theory. What is the process? What is the order? What is the cause and effect, if any, of these places? Is the land already corrupt? Don't go there. That's a bad place there. Places like that. So, yeah, try to just organize the flood of thoughts and ideas that kind of fall under this banner. And this is sort of the first, hopefully, right step in the right direction. Although, direction and space and time, where we're going, we don't need roads or something like that. Trying to think of how to pitch this in the elevator. The movie Young Einstein? Nothing like that. So that's a good step in the right direction going forward. Real quick, before we get into it, I just watched. So, if you are into the stuff that we kind of talk about on this show /channel, etc., you may know who David Wilcock is. He just passed away recently. He's one of the big sort of talking heads. Conspiracies, ancient civilizations, zero gravity, etc. And by the way, I have my window open, so if you hear traffic, I apologize, but it keeps my cat occupied and away from the equipment, causing me to scream when he gets near it. So yeah, David Wilcock, he just passed away, and there's some conflicting information about the man. Like him or lump him, he was an influential guy who was into all this stuff and, promoting these ideas, and very prominent figure in this world. And there are reports that he did himself in. And this is a man who, in this world of conspiratainment, we'll call it, to quote the host of the Farm podcast, I forget his name, Recluse. Conspiratainment. It's become mainstream. It's very mainstream, and it still has this veneer of outsider looking in aspect angle to it. I think conspiracy theory makes people feel it has a baked in sense of inner superiority for some people, because it makes you feel privy to information that is otherwise secret or only known to a select few, etc. So, and that's not a knock on anybody who's into it. I'm super into it. It's just the sort of psychological pedestal placing upon like this neurochemical kick that you kind of get from that effect or that feeling. And within this world, there's sort of an inherent, once again, baked in, it's like structurally inevitable or inescapable, of presenting yourself or playing the part, or authentically being a sort of outsider looking in role. And with that comes what are essentially presuppositions of sorts, preconceived notions that what you're doing is in some way frowned upon by certain individuals who, they have a distinct interest and intent keeping certain ideas secret, etc. Now, I'm not saying, this is, 100% true or whatever, but it's the idea, it's the concepts that are sort of baked into this stuff. And there's been a increasingly suspicious string of missing scientists. I believe the toll is up to 11 at this point, 2 of which are actually confirmed dead. Last I checked, there's 2 who are actually confirmed dead. There's police reports confirming their death, etc. So everyone else, as of now, as of this recording, is essentially MIA. Now, I hate to go straight to a comic book reference out the gate, but this is one of the underlying primary plots of the graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore, famously made into a movie that entirely ignored the overarching plot and became something else entirely. But in that book, scientists go missing. Inexplicably, mysteriously. What's happening to all these scientists and engineers and even cartoonists and writers of fiction, etc., going missing? Nobody knows what's happening. Now, most of these people who are disappearing have associations or vested interest in high strangeness of various sorts. Mad science, quote unquote, we'll call it for now. Theoretical physicists, people into UAP, and when I say UAP in this instance, I mean unidentified anomalous phenomena. Broad range, overarching, high sweeping term for just all this kind of stuff. Now, in the book Watchmen, all these scientists are being put to work on a private island already. Private island, that's not bringing up any good associations, but they've been put to work on a private island to basically craft a doomsday scenario. I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read this book that's been out for several decades now, but we'll just go with, once again, sweeping generalizations, as this has almost nothing to do with the primary topic of today's episode. But they're being put to work on a doomsday plan to enact to essentially save the world. So, I don't know. This rambling introduction that veers off into this tangential topic that I'm discussing now, kind of just my way of saying, I don't know what it is I'm trying to say with this. It's a developing story, obviously, but to paraphrase the great real-life character, Sherlock Holmes, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. So, that's a term, or that's a phrase uttered by a character known for being hyper-rational and incredibly attuned to matters of deduction and examination and deliberation of the information. Thank you, Johnny Cochran. From a writer who was quite the opposite. A man who believed in fairies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. A man who was deeply embedded in the spiritualist movement. So, take that all for what it's worth, I guess. Your mileage may vary. But this is it's just another indicator of what an increasingly strange, weird, and I hesitate to say unpredictable, but because it's almost predictably unpredictable, if that kind of makes sense. But this is what reality is turning into. It's becoming stranger every day. It's like we're seeing fantastical movie plots, unfold around us every day. And maybe it's just the research I've been doing lately, things I've been getting into and reading about. But there's something called hyperstitional warfare. And I think this phrase very much encapsulates a lot of how the world is changing and what the future holds for us. I plan on diving much deeper into this term and the concepts the various concepts that it refers to, etc. But as the old conspiratainment adage goes, quote, do your own research, unquote. Now, I have certain issues with that phrase as well. Do your own research, but realize it doesn't make you an expert. And also, the biggest problem in this particular corner of not just conspiratainment, but just the conspiracy theory world in general. Everyone has locked in on a theory or an idea that they are certain. It's the certainty. And once you lock in on something, it kind of cancels out everything else. It's why I think the idea of saying that aliens are demons, that's it. That shuts everything off. It's like, oh, that's the end of that. Despite being a massive asshole, which is somewhat ironic, Aleister Crowley, I believe, is the one who said it, that belief is the death of knowledge. And in many ways, that holds true. Once again, once you're locked into an idea, once you're like, this is it, this is what it is, everything else, that's it. It's done. There's no room for intellectual growth. There's no more room for exploration or investigation. This is why ideas like Robert Anton Wilson's maybe logic and forms of speculative agnosticism, etc., I think are very good models for examining and interacting with the world and reality in general. If this world and this if this whole field of conspiracy theories and the occult and just, once again, weird shit in general, I mean, if it's shown us anything, it's that you certainly can't trust the narrative, quote unquote, or at least maybe not distrust it, but be skeptical. Locking in on something and investing all this meaning and certainty into any one fixed idea is just it's not good policy, we'll say. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my completely unrelated forward thought for the day, I guess. Just I know it sounds like maybe inaction or and people become very much infused with a certain energy to want to act or build upon any one certain idea or conclusions, etc. But wait and see. I just things are always changing, and people, we learn, we grow. The world learns and grows. Well, ideally, that's how it's supposed to work. But just new information has come to light, man. Just kind of consider that change is the only constant. That's how I'll wrap that up. If I even keep this rambling diatribe in the final cut. Anyways, so in the primary tentpole concept of this episode, kicking off this series, Black Magic Academies, and their potential relations, connections, etc., to anomalous phenomena, hotspots, phenomena. This is the best elevator pitch I could come up with before we jump right into things. So, every region seems to have at least one place people don't usually talk about directly. Not because it's unknown, but because it's too well known. Passed along in warnings, in half-joking stories, in that subtle shift tone when someone says, yeah, don't go out there at night. These are the places where the usual categories begin to blur. Lights appear where there shouldn't be lights. Figures are seen that don't quite resolve into anything recognizable. And time itself, time and space behave strangely. And whatever explanation gets offered, whether it be ghosts, UFOs, folklore, atmospheric anomalies, etc., never quite feels like it covers the whole picture. And at the same time, scattered across history and geography, there are reoccurring stories of hidden groups, secretive traditions, underground schools, or informal, quote-unquote, academies, if you will, where people were said to learn things they weren't or aren't supposed to know. And not just rituals or beliefs, but practices and techniques, dreadful methodologies, ways of interacting with the world that seem to operate just outside of what we consider normal reality, quote-unquote normal, quote-unquote reality. Most of these accounts are easy to dismiss on their own, but when you start placing them next to those same locations, the ones already associated with strange lights, encounters, persistent anomalies, a different question begins to form. Not just what is happening in these places, but whether at some point someone or someones believed it could be studied, harnessed, practiced, perhaps even replicated and taught. Proliferated. Human beings are good at one particular thing. In fact, we're so good at it that we do it without even trying. And that's pattern recognition. So, having said that, going forward, this may all just be a folly, if you will, of overexerted pattern recognition, overactive imagination on my part. But perhaps, and I would say this is probably a fair assumption, pattern recognition is probably one of the things that's helped humanity survive this long and brought us to where we are as a species. The ability to recognize patterns that sets us apart from the animals. Not that they're not capable of it, but it's our level of it. Pattern recognition is an innate trait of higher consciousness, for better or worse. And that relates to everything I said before about the world of conspiratainment, etc. So just keep that in mind going forward. But having said that, let's jump into what, for lack of a better title term for this series going forward, I've dubbed Black Magic Academies and Anomalous Phenomena Hotspots. Let's do it! There are persistent stories found amongst different cultures and across centuries of hidden institutions, places where knowledge isn't simply taught, but transmitted through secrecy, ordeal, and transformation. These aren't schools in the conventional sense, though if one wanted to approach reality in a positive Gnostic sense, you could say all of reality is a school. It's a lot more pleasant than saying we live on a prison planet in a galaxy of bullshit, which, I don't quite dispute that either, but, kind of a bummer. So, anywho, these places aren't schools in the conventional sense. They don't appear on any maps. They most certainly don't advertise their existence, and yet, in folklore, testimony, and scattered historical records, they emerge again and again under different names, different forms, and different cultural interpretations and frameworks. They're often described as academies of a kind, although that term isn't quite entirely accurate. Not necessarily centers of learning per se in the open sense, but closed or secretive systems of initiation. Places where individuals are brought into contact with forces considered dangerous, forbidden, or fundamentally destabilizing, at best. Within these systems, knowledge is not neutral. It's directional, it's applied, and in many cases, even weaponized. The practices attributed to these groups are remarkably consistent. They involve forms of what might be described as assault or combat magic, deliberate use of non-physical means to produce physical, psychological, or environmental effects. Illnesses induced at a distance, misfortune directed with intent, the manipulation of perception, the weather, or biological form. These aren't framed as symbolic acts, but as operational techniques, taught and refined within controlled environments. Entry into such systems is rarely casual. Across multiple traditions, initiation is described as requiring a decisive break from regular everyday human life. This break isn't merely philosophical, it's enacted through transgression. Acts of transgression, acts that violate social, moral, or sometimes even familial bonds in ways that can't be easily reversed. Can't unscrew that light bulb. Can't unring that bell. Ways in which the initiate doesn't simply just acquire forbidden knowledge, but ways in which they become something else entirely. Occupying a position that's no longer fully within the bounds of their original community. Sometimes even within the bounds of what could be considered human. Alongside these accounts of initiation and esoteric practices, there's another recurring element, one that appears with striking regularity, regardless of geography. That's the presence of strange and or inexplicable lights. Small lights, moving lights, lights that appear in remote areas, often at night, often observed at a distance. They hover, drift, accelerate, and then vanish. They're often described as intelligent, or at least responsive. In some traditions, they're believed to be spirits, in others as tools or extensions of the will of a human or otherwise the other. And yet still, in others, they're oftentimes something else entirely, something undefined, present, observable, but largely resistant to any one stable form of interpretation. These lights are rarely reported in isolation, however. They most often appear in conjunction with other phenomena. The sighting of anomalous animals, quote-unquote animals, the presence of humanoid figures that don't behave as expected, distortions in perception of time and space, and the reoccurring sense that the environment itself is behaving differently, as if a place had some will of its own. These clusters of activity tend to concentrate in specific locations, remote landscapes, mountainous regions, dense forests, coastal margins, etc. Places that, in various traditions, are described as liminal crossroads or threshold zones. Areas where the boundaries between categories, natural and unnatural, physical and non-physical, are oftentimes considered to be far less stable. It's within these very same locations that stories of these hidden institutions often emerge. Caves, isolated valleys, forest clearings, coastal enclaves, primeval marshes or swamps, ancient burial mounds, megaliths, geoglyphs, and ritual landscapes, which have persisted through numerous skewed narratives then fused into lost histories to be forever designated as sacred sites. Get used to the phrase ritual landscapes. You're going to hear that quite a bit going forward. Now, perhaps these may be even concentrated locations of ancient, possibly profane powers. Profane as opposed to sacred. What's the opposite of sacred geometry? Infernal geometry. Again and again, these geographies often align. The places where initiation occurs are also often the same locations where various phenomena are most concentrated. The so-called training grounds that are quite often also considered to be quote-unquote hotspots of accumulated high strangeness, which inevitably raises questions that become somewhat difficult for us to ignore. Whether these recurring elements, these secretive systems of initiation, the use of intentionally directed forms of parapsychological assault or combat magic, the seemingly persistent presence of shape-shifting figures, and the suspiciously consistent appearance of ominous, luminous orbs or mobile ghost lights are all merely just parallel developments within human storytelling, or whether they represent fragments of a much larger pattern at work. A pattern which shows us that within the potential overlap of certain locations, practices, and anomalous experiences that, despite their highly strange nature, were once initially considered to be isolated events, quote-unquote, are perhaps not just merely independent incidents of the uncanny, but rather instead represent essential data points within an imperceptible nexus of interconnected, inexplicable phenomena. If such a pattern exists, it likely wouldn't necessarily present itself with any sense of overt clarity. These things often don't. It would be filtered through culture, language, and belief. What's oftentimes described as a spirit in one context might be described as something else in another. What's framed as sorcery in one tradition might be interpreted as technology in another. Asimov? Probably, yeah. Rule number 3, whatever it is. Rule 47, 32? I don't know. If it exists, there's pornography of it. Anywho, the underlying structure, however, the relationships which exist between practitioner, place, and phenomena, would probably exhibit themselves with an inherent level of some consistency. The possibility then isn't that these stories are identical, but that they're variations of a shared framework, a framework that's persisted in various altered forms across time and space. And if that's the case, then certain well-documented modern locations, places where multiple forms of high strangeness converge, may not be anomalies in their own right, but contemporary expressions of something much older. Not new events, just new interpretations. The question isn't simply what's happening in these places, but whether it's happened before, and whether, in some form, it's been studied, practiced, perhaps even taught, within systems that were never meant to be visible from the outside. And if that's the case, if these patterns have appeared before, if they've been recognized, studied, and in some instances deliberately engaged with, then another question begins to emerge, one that's far more difficult to resolve. Which came first, the place or the practice? Whether these locations, these so-called thin places or window areas, these zones of concentrated anomaly, exist as preconditions, natural fault lines in reality, areas where the boundary between worlds is already unstable, already permeable, already prone to producing these kinds of phenomena that later become codified as spirits, ghost lights, or entities, etc. Places that draw our attention not because of what people bring to them, but because of what's already deeply embedded or present there to begin with. Or whether the process works in reverse. Whether repeated acts, such as rituals, transgressions, sustained attention directed towards forces not fully understood, leaves an imprint, kind of psychic or environmental residue. Something cumulative, something that over time alters the character of a location itself, not symbolically but functionally, transforming it into a site where further anomalies become more likely, more frequent, and or more concentrated. If there are sacred sites, places aligned to celestial cycles, constructed with intention, designed to harmonize with natural forces, then it follows that there must also exist their direct opposite or inverse. Locations shaped not towards balance, but towards disruption. Not towards integration, but towards access. Windows, openings, portals, gateways. Points of contact that were never meant to remain open for long, if ever, if at all. Across both Europe and the Americas, across the whole globe essentially, but for the purposes of our initial investigations, these locations in particular, there exist persistent traditions of such places. Burial mounds avoided rather than revered. Standing stones whose purpose is no longer understood, yet which are consistently associated with a sense of some foreboding or unease. Hills which are persistently believed to be inhabited by predominantly, oftentimes, invisible races, mostly of the so-called little people genus, and or by quote-unquote spirits that are neither fully benevolent nor entirely hostile, but more than fully capable of engaging in both. These sites are often described in contradictory terms, simultaneously ancient yet active, abandoned but occupied, silent yet somehow aware, places where paradox reigns, locations which aren't visited casually. Actually, they're more often than not avoided altogether. And in the rare instances when they're seldom spoken of, it's often done in lowered, hushed tones, or in warnings passed down from one generation to the next, accompanied with instructions which specifically state that no one should go there. Not at night, not alone, not at all. Whether these warnings originate from observed phenomena or from events which have been absorbed into memory and transformed into cautionary narratives is, in most instances, difficult to determine. But the continuous consistency of the pattern is difficult to ignore. Certain places are marked, not formally, not with any signage or constructed boundaries necessarily, but through their various associated legends, myths, or folklore, through repetition of those stories, through the quiet insistence that something about that particular location just isn't right. In North America, some of the clearest expressions of this pattern appear not in formal institutions, but in oral traditions which preserve the fragments of some much older framework. One that may predate the arrival of later systems, later structures, and or later interpretations. Best metaphor I can give for all this is how modern Christian churches built on top of or over ancient pagan sites of power or reverence. I would say that's a solid model for a lot of what we'll be getting into throughout this series and later on in the overarching conceptual circus tent. Almost all of these traditions hold examples of what are considered to be liminal spaces or corrupted locations, places which, for one reason or another, essentially render them as accursed lands existing within the collective imagination. Examples which instantly come to mind might include the Bridgewater Triangle, the Pine Barrens, and pretty much the entirety of New Jersey, really. So I've been told. Among the Hopi of the American Southwest, there are accounts of figures referred to as the Two Hearts, individuals said to possess a dual nature, one human, one animal. These aren't simply shapeshifters in the conventional sense, but practitioners whose existence is defined by an imbalance. Where the Hopi emphasize harmony and continuity, the Two Hearts represent inversion and disruption, the deliberate introduction of chaos into systems that would otherwise remain stable. They're described as operating in secrecy, often indistinguishable from others during the day, but active in hidden contexts. There are references, fragmentary, often indirect, to subterranean spaces that mirror the sacred kivas used for communal and ceremonial purposes. These aren't places of prayer or balance. They're described instead as inverted spaces, reverse structures, locations where intent is directed not towards sustaining the world, but towards destabilizing it. Whether these spaces are literal or symbolic is, as with many elements in this framework going forward, unclear. What is clear is the function, a hidden gathering place, a site of coordinated intent, a location where knowledge of a particular kind is shared and applied. Further east, within the Appalachian regions, Cherokee traditions describe beings known as the Raven Mockers. Figures feared not simply for what they are, but for how they operate. By day, they are said to appear as ordinary individuals, often elderly. Watch out for those seniors. Sneaky. I'm old, I don't know anything. I've been around a while. Let me tell you how it's done. See what I'm saying? Paradox. They're embedded within their local communities, but by night, they transform, not always into solid forms, but into something less defined. Luminous, mobile, capable of traversing vast distances in ways that defy ordinary movement. They're often associated, quite consistently, with ominous lights. Not static illumination, but moving lights. Lights that enter homes. Lights that gather. Lights that accompany acts of intrusion, particularly in moments where individuals are considered to be at their most vulnerable. Illness, decline, at the threshold between life and death. These are the conditions under which the Raven Mockers are said to operate. Parasitically extracting something of vital importance, one's very essence or life force, thus extending their own existence at the expense of others. There are also accounts, less widely discussed but persistent, of opposition, of other entities, sometimes described as little people, quote-unquote little people, engaging these figures in conflict. Not physical combat in the conventional sense, but something more difficult to define. Aerial struggles, movements of light against light, events that, when observed from a distance, might be interpreted as nothing more than unusual atmospheric activity. Or maybe there's something else, something that none of these cultures holds any one definitive explanation for. Placed alongside one another, these traditions begin to outline a system that's both older and less formalized than the institutions that would appear later. There are no written hierarchies, no documented trials, no centralized authority, and yet the same core elements are present. Shape-shifting practitioners, the use of non-physical means to produce physical effects, presence of mobile luminous phenomena, hidden or restricted locations associated with these activities. And perhaps most importantly, the suggestion that these practices aren't random, but localized, tied to specific environments, certain landscapes, specific points plotted upon the map. If one extends this pattern backward, beyond recorded history, beyond the point at which these traditions were first documented, what begins to take shape is a speculative but persistent image of a much older landscape. One in which the Americas weren't simply inhabited, but organized in ways that are no longer fully visible, marked by large-scale earthworks, astronomical alignments, geoglyphs, and constructed features whose intended purposes are long forgotten, but still debated. Landscapes that may have been at one time far more integrated, whether ritualistically, observationally, or perhaps even operationally, than they would appear today. Within such a framework, locations associated with anomalies wouldn't be incidental. They would most likely be very well known, identified, avoided, or in some cases, maybe even used, applied practically, for lack of a better term. And if they were used, if certain individuals or groups somehow learned how to interact with them, how to exploit whatever conditions existed there, then what later appears as folklore may, in part, be the residual traces of those interactions. Fragmented and or reinterpreted, but still anchored to those very same places. By the time later systems emerge, whether as structured organizations, named identifiable societies, or properly formalized quote-unquote academies, They may not be creating something entirely new. They may be inheriting it, adapting older knowledge to newer frameworks, imposing structure onto something that was previously far more ephemeral, turning landscapes into institutions, turning a place into a system. Which brings us back to the question, not simply what's happening in these locations, but how long it's been happening, and whether or not these places themselves were always the first teachers, long before anyone thought to build a school around them. There are certain places where the categories begin to break down, locations where the phenomena refuses to remain contained within a single explanation, instead presenting themselves as a shifting collection of lights, entities, and events that seem, at first glance, unrelated. In these places, one doesn't encounter a single mystery, but a convergence. Multiple forms of high strangeness appearing in the same geographic space, often in overlapping sequences, as though they're drawn to a common point of origin. One of the most well-documented modern examples of this convergence can be found in the Uinta Basin, particularly in and around what has come to be known as Skinwalker Ranch. Reports from this region don't describe a singular phenomenon, but a layered environment in which luminous orbs move with apparent intelligence across the landscape. Unidentified aerial objects appear and vanish without any clear trajectory. Large predatory animals, quote-unquote animals, exhibit behaviors inconsistent with known biology, and humanoid figures are occasionally observed at the periphery of vision before disappearing entirely. These events are not isolated. They occur in clusters, often in the same locations, sometimes within the same sequence of observation, creating the impression not of separable occurrences, but of a system in operation. What makes this region particularly significant is not simply the presence of these phenomena, but the cultural framework that surrounds them. Within Navajo tradition, there exists a concept known as the Yi Naldushi, term often translated as skinwalker. Unlike the simplified versions that circulate in popular media, this figure isn't merely a shapeshifter, but the product of a specific initiatory path, one that belongs to a broader and more secretive system, sometimes referred to as the witchery way. This system doesn't function as an open tradition. It's described instead as a hidden counter-practice, one that mirrors the structure of healing traditions, but inverts their purpose. The medicine man, in many instances, is part of your local government. To put it in modern terms, I guess. The medicine man, to put it in modern context, is part of the government, basically, in a good way, a controlling but structurally beneficial office or role. This is the opposite. According to accounts gathered from both ethnographic sources and oral tradition, initiation into this path is not symbolic. It requires transgression so severe that it makes a permanent break from ordinary human relations. Most commonly, this act is described as the killing of a close family member. The purpose of such an act is not simply to demonstrate one's commitment, but to sever the initiate from the moral and social framework of their community. It is, in effect, a ritualized form of self-imposed exile. Kind of like a big face tattoo. Nothing small, modest, that's fine. Like a big old face tattoo, metaphorically speaking. One that transforms the individual into something no longer bound by conventional limits. Following this initiation, the practitioner is said to acquire abilities that extend beyond the symbolic. Shapeshifting into animal forms, manipulation of environmental conditions, the use of so-called corpse powders, and substances derived from the human body, whether alive or dead. The invocation of malevolent forces associated with the dead. These practices are not described as metaphorical, but as operational, part of a learned system passed through controlled transmission. What's particularly notable is the location of these practices. They aren't said to occur randomly, but in specific places: remote canyons, caves, isolated regions often described as thin places or window areas where the boundary between worlds is understood to be permeable. It's within these locations that initiation is said to occur, and it's within these same regions that the highest concentration of anomalous phenomena is reported. This overlap raises a question that's persisted across multiple fields of study: whether the presence of high strangeness in these locations is incidental, or whether it's in some way connected to the practices historically associated with them. Some researchers have proposed that what's being observed in places like the Uinta Basin is not a collection of independent events, but the result of a disruption, a localized alteration in the conditions that normally separate different layers of reality. So within this framework, the actions attributed to practitioners of systems like the Witchery Way aren't simply acts of transformation, but of transaction. Methods of accessing or influencing a boundary that's otherwise predominantly stable. If such a boundary can be altered, even temporarily, then the consequences would not be limited to a single type of phenomena. Instead, one would expect to see exactly what's reported: a disorienting mixture of lights, entities, apparitions, and environmental anomalies, all appearing within the same space, not because they're directly related to one another, but because they're all passing through the same opening. Sorry. Oh. In this sense, the region itself becomes the primary subject. Not the individual phenomena, but the conditions that allow them to occur. And this is where the pattern begins to extend beyond one single location. Because when one examines other regions of the world, particularly those with long-standing traditions of ritual practice, initiation, and sorcery, one begins to find the same structural elements repeating. Not identical in form, but consistent in function. A defined location, a hidden or restricted body of knowledge, a system of initiation that involves transgression or transformation, the use of non-human intermediaries, and perhaps most consistently, the presence of lights. Those goddamn lights. Small lights, moving lights, lights that appear with intention, that follow, that observe, that vanish, described in different terms depending on the culture, spirits, souls, manifestations, but exhibiting behaviors that are remarkably consistent across time and geography. There's also the recurring presence of shape-shifting figures. Individuals capable of altering their form, often associated with animal characteristics, often operating at the margins of society. These figures aren't isolated myths. They appear in multiple forms, multiple traditions, often in connection with the same types of locations and the same types of phenomena. And then there's the matter of initiation. Across different cultures, one finds repeated references to rites that are very wrong. Rites that involve not just symbolic transformation, but acts of deliberate transgression, breaking of taboos, violation of social norms, severing ties with family or community. These acts serve a functional purpose. They create a boundary between the initiate and the rest of society, placing them in a category that's neither fully human nor entirely other. It's within this liminal state that the acquisition of power is said to occur. When these elements are considered together, not as isolated beliefs, but as components of a system, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that suggests that the range of high strangeness observed in modern hotspots of anomalous phenomena may not be entirely new, but rather the continuation of processes that have been described in different languages for centuries. It's within this context that the island chain off the southern coast of Chile becomes particularly significant. Because in the Chiloé archipelago, one finds not only the same elements, lights, shapeshifters, ritual practice, but something more structured, something that moves beyond scattered accounts and into the realm of organization. A system that, according to historical testimony, operated with a variety of defined roles, centralized authority, and physical headquarters embedded within the landscape itself. From the isolated islands of southern Chile, where dense forests creep in against the coastline and fog moves in heavy, shifting walls off the Pacific, emerges one of the most structured and persistently documented black magic societies in the Americas, the RECTA Provincia. RECTA? No, never mind. Operating primarily across the Chiloé archipelago, this organization occupies a unique position within the broader framework we've been examining. Unlike the more diffuse, lineage-based traditions found elsewhere, the RECTA Provincia presents itself both in folklore and in the historical records as something far more organized, something closer to an institution, or, depending on how one interprets the accounts, something very much like an academy. By the late 19th century, authorities in Chile began to hear persistent reports of a clandestine organization operating within Chiloé, an underground society of sorcerers who exercised influence over local communities through the use of magic, intimidation, and a system of internal governance that existed parallel to the official state. These reports culminated in a series of arrests in 1880, leading to what would become known as the Chiloé witch trials. Testimony gathered during these proceedings, later compiled and analyzed by figures such as Ramon Espec, describes an organization that referred to itself as La Recta Provincia, or alternatively, La Mayoría. According to multiple witnesses, this was not a loose association of individuals, but a structured hierarchy. At its apex stood a central authority, often described as a king or a chief, supported by regional leaders who oversaw different districts of the archipelago. Beneath them were operatives who carried out the will of the organization, enforcing its decisions and, when necessary, administering punishment. The language used in these testimonies is strikingly administrative. Jurisdictions, orders, enforcement. It reads less like folklore and more like the outline of a shadow government. At the center of this system was a physical location, a cave near the village of Quicavi, known as the Cueva de Quicavi, that was described as the headquarters of the organization, a place where meetings were held, knowledge was preserved, and initiations were conducted. Entry, according to testimony, was restricted, and the cave itself was said to be guarded by a being known as the Invunche, human transformed through ritual deformation into a living sentinel, bound to the site and incapable of leaving it. The creation of the Invunche represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Recta Provincia practices. According to testimony, the process began with the abduction of a male infant, preferably a firstborn, who was then subjected to a series of ritual mutilations and modifications. The right leg was allegedly broken, twisted to attach to the back. The tongue was split or forked, and the child was fed excessively human flesh, particularly that of executed criminals. This gradual transformation created a being neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between, a living guardian whose very existence served as a deterrent to intruders. The Invunche's role was not merely protective, but symbolic, representing the complete subversion of natural order that the organization embodied. Initiation into the Recta Provincia was not symbolic. Testimony suggests that prospective members were required to renounce their previous religious affiliations and undergo acts that bound them irrevocably to the group. While the exact nature of these rites is only partially recorded, they are consistently described as transgressive and severe, implying a process designed not only to induct but to transform, to sever the initiate from their former identity and integrate them into a new, hidden order. The initiation process reportedly involves a series of progressively more demanding trials. Novices were first required to demonstrate their commitment through acts of theft or sabotage against community members who had refused to pay tribute to the organization. This was followed by participation in ritual cannibalism, where initiates consumed human flesh, often from victims of magical attacks or executed criminals, thereby breaking one of the most fundamental taboos of Catholic society. The final stage involved a formal pact with the organization's leadership, sealed with blood and accompanied by oaths of secrecy under penalty of death. Only after completing these trials could one be considered a full member of the RECTA Provincia. Within this structure operated individuals known broadly as brujos, witches, warlocks, figures whose practices align closely with the concept of the calcu in Mapuche and Huiliche? I'm going to go with Huiliche. I think that's how you say it. I've heard it pronounced different ways, so if I'm mispronouncing that, I do apologize. But yes, the concept of the calcu in Mapuche and Huiliche cosmology. Unlike the Machi, who function as healers and mediators between the human and spiritual worlds, the calcu are understood as agents of imbalance. Their role is not to restore harmony, but to manipulate it, to direct spiritual forces towards specific outcomes, often harmful ones. In this framework, illness and misfortune are not random. They're sent. They're weaponized. Accounts gathered during and after the trials describe a system in which acts of misfortune, sickness, crop failure, sudden death, etc., could be attributed to intentional magical aggression. These acts weren't necessarily carried out arbitrarily. They could be commissioned, requested, or ordered as part of the organization's internal logic. Disputes could be settled not through courts, but through sorcery. Social norms could be enforced not through law, but through fear of unseen retaliation. The tools attributed to these practitioners are as specific as the structure itself. Members were said to possess garments known as macuña. I believe that's how you say it. Gonna be some foreign words to me here, so just roll with me on this. This garment, known as the macuña, is constructed from human skin, which allowed them to fly or transform. They employed familiars, creatures or entities used for surveillance and communication. Among these are references to lizards that transmitted knowledge, and more strikingly, to luminous entities known as Anchimayan, animated lights that could move through the landscape, observe, and act on behalf of the sorcerer. And these lights are particularly significant. Described as small, mobile sources of illumination, the Anchimayan occupy a space that's difficult to categorize. They're not simply symbolic. They're described as functional, used for reconnaissance, for signaling, for interaction. They appear, they move with intention, and they disappear. In another context, they might be labeled differently. Atmospheric phenomena, ball lightning, unidentified aerial objects. But within Chiloé, they're understood as extensions of human agency, manifestations of will operating through a medium that blurs the line between the physical and the unseen. The Anchimayan were reportedly created through a specific ritual involving the eyes of a recently deceased person, preferably someone who had died violently or unnaturally. These eyes were treated with certain herbs and spices, various ritualistic oils, and then placed in a special container where they underwent a transformation process. After several days of ritual work, they would begin to emit light and develop a degree of autonomous movement. These luminous entities could then be directed by their creator to observe specific locations, transmit information telepathically, or even cause harm through intense, focused light. Their creation represents another example of the Recta Provincia's subversion of natural order and processes, turning the organ of vision into an independent surveillance entity. This pattern repeats across the archipelago's broader folklore. There is the Chilote, a phantom ship said to appear at night along the coast, illuminated and alive with sound, crewed by sorcerers and the spirits of the dead. Witnesses describe it as simultaneously material and immaterial, visible, audible, and yet capable of vanishing without a trace. It moves across the water in ways that defy conventional navigation, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly, often accompanied by music or voices carried over the wind. Chilote was not merely a spectral vessel, but served as the mobile headquarters of the Recta Provincia's maritime operations. According to testimony, it functioned as both a meeting place for high-ranking members and a transport for conducting raids on coastal communities. The ship was said to be crewed by both living brujos and the spirits of those who had died serving the organization. Its ability to appear and disappear at will was attributed to specific enchantments that allowed it to navigate between the physical world and a parallel spiritual dimension. The Chilote's presence was often announced by strange lights on the water and unearthly music that could be heard from miles away, phenomena that align with modern descriptions of UFO encounters in the region. Taken in isolation, any one of these elements could be dismissed as myth, but taken together and placed within the context of documented testimony, structured organization, and a persistent cultural framework, they begin to form a system in which lights, entities, and transformations and locations are not random, but interconnected. A system in which the supernatural is not an external force, but a set of practices embedded within human society. What makes Chiloé particularly compelling is that this system doesn't exist solely in the past. Ethnographic studies and contemporary accounts indicate that belief in sorcery and in the presence of Calcu remains active in many parts of the archipelago. Illness is still, in some cases, interpreted as the result of intentional harm. Practitioners, whether openly acknowledged or not, are still believed to operate within communities, and reports of anomalous phenomena, lights over the water, unexplained sounds, encounters with unknown entities, continue to surface, often interpreted with the same framework that's existed for generations. At the same time, Chile as a whole has become one of the more active regions for the study of unidentified aerial phenomena, with official bodies such as CEFAA, CEFAA, documenting cases involving structured objects, intelligent movement, and unexplained aerial activity. While these reports are typically framed in technological or scientific terms, the overlap is observed in behavior. Lights that move with intent, objects that appear and disappear, localized concentrations of activity, raises questions about how such phenomena are interpreted across different cultural contexts. In southern Chile, including regions adjacent to Chiloé, modern accounts have emerged of individuals reporting contact with non-human intelligences, communication experiences, and encounters that blend elements of the technological and the mystical. One such case, often referred to as the friendship case, which already sounds very terrifying for some reason, involves prolonged interaction between a civilian and a group of entities described as human-like, advanced, and operating from a concealed location. The details are inconsistent, at times contradictory, yet structured enough to suggest an underlying pattern, one that echoes, in form, if not in language, the narratives associated with earlier traditions. What begins to emerge isn't a clean transition from folklore to modern-day accounts, but a continuity, a shift in interpretation rather than a disappearance of experience. Where one era speaks of witches and familiars, another speaks of entities and craft. Where one describes luminous spirits, another describes aerial phenomena. The forms change, the structure remains, and within that structure, certain constants persist. A defined location, a network of practitioners, a body of knowledge passed through initiation, the use of non-human intermediaries, the presence of lights, mobile, intentional, and often observed at the periphery of human activity. Perhaps most importantly, a system in which these elements aren't isolated but integrated into a coherent, if hidden, framework. Whether the Recta Provincia existed exactly as described in the trial records is, in some sense, a secondary question. What matters is that the idea of such an organization was not only conceivable, but credible within the cultural context of Chiloé. That multiple individuals, under scrutiny, described a consistent structure, that the practices attributed to it align with a broader cosmology that continues to influence interpretation of anomalous events to this very day. In that sense, the Recta Provincia may be understood not only as a historical phenomenon, but as a lens, a way of organizing and interpreting experiences that don't fit neatly within conventional categories, a system that allows for the integration of lights, shape-shifting entities, or non-human entities, and transformations into a single narrative framework. And if that framework persists, if it continues to shape how events are perceived and understood, then the boundary between past and present becomes less defined. The institution, whether literal or conceptual, doesn't simply vanish. It adapts, recedes into the shadows, and reappears in altered form, embedded within new language, new symbols, new contexts. Not gone, just translated, and in certain places still anchored to the land itself, hidden in the forests or along the coastlines, and, if the old testimonies are to be believed, deep within a cave where entry was never meant to be easy, and where whatever knowledge was kept there was never intended to leave. Not fully, not all at once, perhaps not for everyone. And yet, even within the framework of Recta Provincia, there are indications that the system did not emerge in isolation. The structure described in the 1880 testimonies, hierarchy, initiation, subterranean meeting places, the transmission of specialized knowledge, suggests not only a local development, but a convergence, a layering of traditions. Because while the practices attributed to the Calcu align clearly with indigenous Mapuche and Huilliche cosmology, the organizational form itself, the idea of some hidden academy, quote-unquote academy, a centralized place of instruction and initiation, points towards another influence. The Spanish colonizers brought with them not just Catholicism, but a complex body of magical knowledge rooted in medieval European traditions. Grimoires like the Key of Solomon, the Book of Abramelin, and later the more accessible texts of ceremonial magic that circulated among colonial administrators and clergy. These works described structured systems of initiation, hierarchical organizations of spirits, and precise methods for creating magical effects, concepts that would have been both familiar and alien to indigenous practitioners. What likely occurred in Chiloé was not simply the suppression of native traditions, nor their preservation in isolation, but a synthesis, a merging of Mapuche concepts of spiritual power with European organizational models. Shamanism meets ritualistic or ceremonial magic. The result was something new, a hybrid system that incorporated the Invunche and Antimayan of indigenous belief, but structured them within an academy-like hierarchy reminiscent of European magical societies. This synthesis is evident in the very name Recta Provincia, a term that carries echoes of both Spanish administrative divisions and indigenous concepts of spiritual jurisdiction. The use of formal titles, written records, and structured initiation rituals reflects European influence, while the specific practices, the creation of guardians, the use of luminous entities, the connection to specific geographical features, remain distinctly rooted in local indigenous cosmology. The geographical isolation of Chiloé likely facilitated this unique development. Cut off from both colonial authorities and the mainland for extended periods, the archipelago became a cultural laboratory where traditions could merge and evolve without external influence. The result was a system that incorporated elements from multiple sources while maintaining coherence through its connection to the landscape itself. This pattern of convergence isn't unique to Chiloé. Similar processes occurred elsewhere in the Americas, where European magical traditions encountered indigenous systems. What makes Chiloé remarkable is the degree to which this synthesis was documented and the persistence of the resulting systems into the present day. The RECTA PROVINCIA represents not just a fusion of traditions, but a model for how magical systems adapt and evolve under colonial pressures, transforming from purely indigenous practices into hybrid systems that incorporate elements of the colonizers' worldview while maintaining their essential connection to place and community. The cave at Quicavi stands as a powerful symbol of this convergence, a physical location that embodies both indigenous sacred geography and European concepts of hidden knowledge. It's simultaneously a Mapuche place of power and a European-style academy of magic. Within its depths, according to testimony, were kept not only the tools and artifacts of local sorcery, but also written records, books, scrolls, and documents that represented a distinctly European approach to preserving magical knowledge. This documentary aspect is particularly significant. While indigenous traditions typically relied on oral transmission, the RECTA Provincia reportedly maintained written records of its activities, membership, rituals, etc. These documents were said to include detailed instructions for creating magical effects, lists of members, and their territories, as well as accounts of the organization's history. The existence of such records suggests a formalization of knowledge that goes beyond typical indigenous practices, pointing instead to a system influenced by European approaches to magical scholarship. The RECTA Provincia thus represents a unique example of what anthropologists call creative syncretism. Not merely the blending of traditions, but the emergence of something new through their interaction. It's a system that could have only developed in the specific context of colonial Chiloé, where isolation, cultural contact, and the persistence of indigenous beliefs combined to create a magical tradition unlike any other in the Americas. Today, the legacy of this synthesis continues to shape how anomalous events are interpreted in that region. When lights appear over the water, they may be described not only as the Anchimayan, but also as UFOs. When strange sounds are heard in the forest, they may be attributed not only to spirits, but also to secret experiments. The framework established by the RECTA Provincia provides a template for understanding the unexplained, one that incorporates both indigenous and Western elements, allowing for multiple interpretations of the same phenomena. In this sense, the RECTA Provincia has outlived its historical manifestation. Even if the organization described in the 1880 trials no longer exists in the same form, the conceptual framework it established continues to influence how the people of Chiloé make sense of experiences that fall outside ordinary reality. It remains a living system of interpretation, one that continues to evolve as it encounters new phenomena and new ways of understanding them. The cave at Quicavi, whether it ever truly functioned as described or not, stands as a powerful metaphor for this process, a place where different traditions met and merged, creating something new in the process. It reminds us that magical systems aren't static relics of the past, but dynamic entities that continue to adapt and evolve, even in the face of modernization and rationalism. In the end, the RECTA Provincia teaches us that the most enduring magical traditions are those that can incorporate new elements without losing their essential character. It shows us that colonization doesn't always mean destruction, but sometimes can lead to creation. And it suggests that the boundary between folklore and modernity, between indigenous and colonial, between magic and technology, may be more flexible than we typically assume. The lights still appear over the waters of Chiloé. The sounds still echo through its forests. And people still seek to understand these phenomena, drawing on whatever conceptual tools are available to them, whether ancient traditions or modern scientific frameworks. In this ongoing process of interpretation and meaning-making, the legacy of the Recta Provincia continues to exert its influence, not as a historical artifact, but as a living system of thought that continues to shape how reality is understood in one of the most mysterious regions of the Americas. Yet the idea of such a place, hidden, subterranean, devoted to the transmission of forbidden knowledge, does not emerge in isolation within the cultural landscape of southern Chile. It carries with it echoes of an older pattern, one that predates its arrival in the Americas and extends deep into the folklore of Europe. In Spain, particularly in the region of Salamanca, there are long-standing traditions of a secret underground school where students were said to gather under the tutelage of the devil himself, learning arts that existed outside the bounds of sanctioned religion and society. With the arrival of Spanish colonists, missionaries, and sailors, many of whom carried not only official doctrine, but also fragments of regional superstition, folk belief, and esoteric lore, these ideas didn't simply disappear. They traveled. And once introduced into the New World, they encountered pre-existing indigenous frameworks that already recognized hidden places of power, spirit intermediaries, and transformative rites. What emerges in regions like Chiloé is not a direct transplant, but a convergence, an overlapping of systems in which the European concept of the Salamanca begins to merge with local cosmologies, eventually contributing to the formation of structures like the Recta Provincia. In this sense, the Salamanca is not merely a parallel tradition, but a potential ancestor, a template carried across the Atlantic, reshaped by new environments and woven into a landscape that was already alive with its own forms of mystery. In the folklore of southern Chile and Argentina, there also exists a concept known as La Salamanca. Unlike the Recta Provincia, which appears in historical records with named individuals and described hierarchies, the Salamanca is more elusive. It's not a single fixed institution, but a category of place, a hidden location, often subterranean, where individuals gather to learn forbidden knowledge. They enter into pacts with non-human entities or intelligences and undergo processes of transformation that remove them from ordinary society. These places are most often described as caves, remote, concealed, and difficult to access. They function as both physical and symbolic thresholds, points of entry into a different order of reality. Within them, according to regional accounts, initiates are instructed in practices that closely mirror those attributed to the brujos of Chiloé: shapeshifting, spirit manipulation, the use of familiars, and the deliberate infliction of harm through non-physical means. What's particularly striking is the consistency of the narrative structure. Entry into the Salamanca is not casual. It requires invitation or discovery, or in some cases, a form of coercion. Once inside, the initiate is subjected to trials, tests of endurance, loyalty, and obedience. There are often references to a central figure presiding over these gatherings, frequently described in terms that align with European conceptions of the devil, or a devil-like entity. Instruction is given, not freely, but conditionally. Knowledge is granted in exchange for something: service, allegiance, or a form of binding agreement that places the initiate within a system they cannot easily leave. These elements are not native to the Americas. They align closely with older European traditions associated with what might be called devil's schools, hidden academies said to exist beneath cities, within caves, or at the edges of known territory. One of the most well-known of these is associated with Salamanca, Spain. where medieval and early modern folklore speaks of a subterranean chamber beneath the city in which the devil himself was said to instruct a select group of students in forbidden arts. Similar traditions appear across Europe, often localized but structurally consistent. Secret gatherings, nocturnal instructions, the presence of a non-human teacher, and the acquisition of knowledge that confers power at a cost. When these traditions were carried to the Americas through colonization, they didn't simply replace existing belief systems, they merged with them. The result, in regions like southern Chile, is not a direct continuation of European folklore, nor a purely indigenous system, but a hybrid, one in which European concepts of pacts, hierarchies, and instruction are layered onto pre-existing cosmologies that already included shape-shifting practitioners, spirit intermediaries, and a landscape understood to be active and responsive. Within these hybrid systems, the Salamanca becomes less a single location and more of an archetype, a recurring structure that manifests wherever certain conditions are met. Isolation, liminality, the presence of a tradition of hidden knowledge, and a cultural framework capable of integrating the idea of initiation through transgression. It's in effect a template, a way of organizing space, practice, and experience into a coherent form. Seen in this light, the relationship between the Salamanca and the RECTA PROVINCIA becomes clearer. The latter provides the organizational body, the hierarchy, the enforcement, the social function, while the former provides the conceptual architecture of the hidden school, a place where knowledge is transmitted, where initiates are transformed, and where contact with non-human forces is formalized within a structured environment. Within this hybrid system, the Salamanca becomes less a single location and more of an archetype, a recurring structure that manifests wherever certain conditions are met. Isolation, liminality, the presence of a tradition of hidden knowledge, and a cultural framework capable of integrating the idea of initiation through transgression. It is, in effect, a template, a way of organizing space, practice, and experiences into a coherent form. Seen in this light, the relationship between the Salamanca and RECTA PROVINCIA becomes clearer. The latter provides the organizational body, the hierarchy, the enforcement, the social function, while the former provides the conceptual architecture of the hidden school, a place where knowledge is transmitted, where initiates are transformed, and where contact with non-human forces is formalized within a structured environment. And this pattern does not end in South America. Across Europe, one finds variations of the same idea. In parts of the British Isles, traditions associated with cunning practitioners, figures who navigated the boundary between healing and harm, suggest the existence of knowledge networks that were never fully visible, passed through selective transmission rather than open teaching. In Italy, historical accounts of nocturnal gatherings, sometimes described as battles fought in altered states of consciousness or as spiritual forms, hint at organized systems operating parallel to official religious structures. In France and Spain, scattered references persist to hidden locations where instruction in forbidden practices was said to occur, often tied to specific geographic features, caves, mountains, ruins, etc. These traditions may differ in detail but not in form. They describe systems of initiation. They describe the acquisition of power through transgression. They describe contact with entities that are not entirely human. And perhaps most consistently, they describe locations, specific places where these processes are concentrated, where the boundary between worlds is understood to be permeable, and where phenomena that resist conventional explanation are most likely to occur. What emerges when these elements are placed side by side is not a series of isolated myths, but a network of correspondences, a recurring model that appears, adapts, and reappears across cultures, each time shaped by local context but retaining a recognizable core. The Salamanca, no more, in its South American form, is one expression of that model. The RECTA PROVINCIA is another. And beyond them, across the Atlantic and further still, there are others. Some better documented, some preserved only in fragments, some still embedded within living traditions, their structures intact but their visibility reduced. If the pattern holds, then these aren't separate stories. They're variations of the same idea. An idea that suggests that certain forms of knowledge have always been organized, always been transmitted, and always been tied to a specific place. Not everywhere, but in specific locations where something about the environment itself seems to support, or at least coincide with, the kinds of phenomena that continue to be reported in the present. Which raises the possibility that what's being observed in modern hotspots is not unprecedented, but part of a continuity, one that extends backwards through folklore, through testimony, through layered traditions that have absorbed and reinterpreted one another over time. And if that continuity can be traced, the connections between these systems can be followed across geography and history, then the next step is clear. To go back where some of these ideas first took recognizable form, back across the Atlantic, back into the older traditions, where the concept of the hidden school, of the subterranean academy, of the pact-bound initiate, of knowledge transmitted in secrecy and at a cost, was already firmly established, long before it was carried into new landscapes and merged with new cosmologies. Because if the Salamanca, not gonna do it, of South America is a reflection, then somewhere there must be a source, or at least an earlier version of the same pattern. And that's where the next part of this investigation begins. We're going to Europa. That's going to do it for this first introductory episode. I've got a 1.5 coming out after this. This is very closely related. Covers some more stuff. This is North and South America. I've got a 1.5 that's going to explore some of this more in depth, specific traditions, locations, etc. And then after that, we're headed to Europe. Maybe parts of. I'm taking it back to like old maps on this one, so Eurasia, we'll call it. Yeah, we're doing a world tour of this idea, these black magic academies, quote unquote, and their potential connections, associations, overlap with quote unquote hotspots of high strangeness and various anomalous phenomena. So yeah, that's going to do it for this first episode. I'm really excited about this series. Man, this is crazy. Like, when we get into the larger overarching ideas of infernal geometry, psychogeography of a dark variety, megalopolomancy, so a word I just love to say out loud. It's going to get crazy, yo. This is pretty eye-opening stuff as far as like some of the ideas I've been introduced to. And when we kick it into modern era and start looking at more contemporary expressions or forms of these ideas, it's not hard to make a jump to places like places or organizations like let's say Area 51, the Dulce base, the Aviary, or the even more speculative Aquarium, if you're familiar with such an idea. The secret science cities of Soviet Russia, the secret science cities of modern-day China, secret space programs, breakaway civilizations, etc. I mean, it all kind of seeds from these ideas into modern-day, contemporary, urban legend, conspiracy theory, occult lore, etc. So yeah, this is shaping up to be quite an adventure. Like, very psyched to get deeper into this stuff, and I'm glad to have you guys on board our ghost ship into into the realms of high strangeness. Thank you guys very much. Man, you guys are the fucking best. Thank you for all the listens, the likes, the comments. Keep them coming. Love it. Love to interact with you guys. hearing from you guys, and just thank you so much, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. You guys, goddamn, you're the best. That's gonna do it for this episode of Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht, and trying to think if there's anything else that I should mention. 1.5 episode. Okay, yeah, I think that's it. Thank you guys. You're the best. I fucking love you. Can't wait to see you on the next one. Peace.
Yeah, I thought so.